The Freedom Riders were an interracial group of civil rights activists who participated in bus trips across the American South in 1961 to protest segregated bus terminals. And if this is the type of content that you enjoy, you can find more content like this at onemichistory.com. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on my Buy Me Coffee and Patreon page in the description below, and give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's get started.
New on Curiosity Stream. How do you connect a 16th century potato to limitless energy production? Could Napoleon's toothpick have a direct link to a machine that predicts the future? And how can a 1700s conch shell chart a course to humans connecting their brains to the internet? James Burke's visionary series Connections returns for a new generation. Experience all new Connections. With monthly, annual, and bundled plans, find the one that works for you at curiositystream.com.
The Freedom Riders were inspired by the Congress for Racial Equality and the 1947 Journey for Reconciliation. Just like the Freedom Riders, the Journey for Reconciliation was intended to test the 1946 Supreme Court decision in Morgan versus Virginia that found that segregated bus seating was unconstitutional. CORE's 16-member team, 8 white and 8 black riders, planned to visit 15 cities in Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky, starting in Washington, D.C. But soon after their trip, the group was arrested and sentenced to serve on a chain gang in North Carolina for violating the local segregation laws on public transportation. However, their lack of confrontation resulted in very little media attention, and their focus on the Upper South, where the risk of violence was not as high, led to CORE's Freedom Rides being considered a failure. 14 years later, in the face of sit-ins, boycotts, and the emergence of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, New Freedom Rides hope to harness national attention and force the federal enforcement and policy changes. In 1960, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Boynton versus Virginia that segregation in facilities provided to interstate travelers, such as bus terminals, restaurants, and restrooms, was unconstitutional. Prior to this decision, 2 students, John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette, integrated their bus ride from Nashville, Tennessee, by sitting in the front of the bus and refusing to move. After the ride, they saw CORE was recruiting volunteers for participation in a Freedom Ride, a longer bus trip throughout the South, to test the enforcement of Boynton versus Virginia. Lafayette's parents would not permit him to participate, but Lewis joined 12 other activists and formed an interracial group that underwent extensive training in nonviolent direct action before launching the ride. The very first Freedom Ride began on May 4th, 1961, and was led by James Farmer, CORE's executive director. 13 young riders, 7 black, 6 white, left Washington, D.C. on a Greyhound and a Trailway bus. Their plan was to ride through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi before ending in New Orleans, where a rally had been planned. The Freedom Riders' idea was that at least one interracial pair would sit in adjoining seats and at least one black rider would sit in the front of the bus, because under segregation laws, these seats were reserved for white customers only. The rest of the team would sit scattered throughout the bus, with one rider abiding by the South segregation rules in order to avoid arrest and contact CORE and arrange for bail for those that had been arrested. Although the group faced some resistance in Virginia, it wasn't until the riders reached Rock Hill, South Carolina, that they encountered some actual violence. John Lewis and another rider were beaten, and another rider was arrested for attempting to use a white-only restroom. This also attracted widespread media coverage, and after the incident in Rock Hill, the riders met with Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists in Atlanta for dinner. During that meeting, Martin Luther King whispered to Jet reporter Simon Booker, covering the Freedom Rides, and stated, "You'll never make it through Alabama." May 14th, as the ride continued to Anniston, Alabama, the riders were met with a violent mob of over 100 people. Before their arrival, the Anniston PD had given permission to the Ku Klux Klan to allow violence against the Freedom Riders without fear of arrest. As soon as the first bus pulled up, the bus driver yelled out, "Well, boys, they're here. I brought you some niggers and some nigger lovers." Soon, the bus was firebombed, and while it burned, the mob held the doors shut, intending on burning the riders to death. The mob then beat the passengers as they poured out of the burning bus. When the second bus, the Trailway, reached Anniston, it pulled into the terminal almost an hour later after the Greyhound attack. It was also boarded by 8 Klansmen, and they beat the Freedom Riders, leaving them unconscious in the back of the bus. The violence would continue on the Trailway's bus when it reached the Birmingham terminal. Eugene Bull Connor, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, offered absolutely no protection. As the riders exited the bus, they were beaten with bats, lead pipes, and bicycle chains. And although the violence garnered national media attention, the series of attacks and the pressure from the Kennedy administration prompted CORE to end their campaign, and the riders would complete their trip by flying to New Orleans. The decision to end the ride frustrated the student activists who argued that they expected violence and we shouldn't let this stop us because it could kill the movement. So Diane Nash, organizer of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, pushed to find replacement and resume the rides. Now, under organizational support from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Freedom Rides continued. Many, including Martin Luther King, were wary of this decision and declined to join the rides after being asked by SNCC. James Farmer from CORE also continued to express his reservations about continuing the ride. He felt like continuing the Freedom Rides was suicide. And because of this fractured support, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organizers had difficulty securing the necessary resources. But nonetheless, May 17, 1961, 7 men and 3 women boarded a bus from Nashville to Birmingham, Alabama to resume the Freedom Rides. Just before reaching Alabama, the bus pulled into the Birmingham station where all of the riders were promptly arrested for defying segregation laws. These arrests, coupled with the difficulty finding a driver and logistical issues, caused the riders to be stranded in Birmingham, Alabama for several days. As violence escalated, the federal government intervened behind the scenes when Attorney General Robert Kennedy called the Greyhound Company and demanded they find a driver. Seeking to defuse the dangerous situation, John Siegenthaler from the Justice Department met with Alabama Governor John Patterson, and Siegenthaler agreed to accompany the Freedom Rides. Siegenthaler then informed Patterson that it was the government's duty to protect the citizens on the Freedom Rides. Siegenthaler also spoke with Diane Nash and warned her that the Freedom Rides could result in violence and death. She responded to him by stating, "We know that someone will be killed, but we cannot let violence overcome nonviolence." Under intense public pressure from the Kennedy administration, Greyhound found a driver. Governor Patterson reluctantly promised to protect the bus from mobs and snipers from Birmingham to Montgomery. But what actually happened as the bus departed from Montgomery with full police escort on the morning of May 20th. However, as agreed, the state troopers left the buses at the Montgomery bus line, but the local PD were ordered to meet the Freedom Rides in Montgomery. However, they never actually showed up, and the bus entered the terminal unprotected. The riders were then attacked by a mob with baseball bats and pipes, and John Siegenthaler was left unconscious lying in the street. Ambulances refused to take the wounded to the hospital, and local black residents had to come and rescue them. Once the police finally arrived, they served the riders with an injunction barring them from continuing the Freedom Rides in Alabama. At the same time, Martin Luther King was on a speaking tour in Chicago, and upon learning of the violence, the next day, May 21st, he staged a rally at Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church with more than 1,500 people. King blamed Governor Patterson for aiding and abetting the forces of violence and called for federal intervention, and declaring that the federal government should not stand idly by while bloodthirsty mobs beat nonviolent students with impunity. While the rally was happening, a mob of more than 3,000 attacked the rally attendees, with only a handful of U.S. Marshals there to protect the church from assault and from firebombs. The city and the state police made no attempt to restore order. Civil rights leaders appealed to the president for protection, and Kennedy would threaten to intervene with federal troops if the governor did not protect his people. So Governor Patterson ordered the Alabama National Guard to disperse the mob, and they escorted the people out of the church at dawn. Undeterred, the very next day, more Freedom Riders arrived in Montgomery to continue the rides throughout the South and replace the riders that were still in the hospital. Behind the scenes, the Kennedy administration had arranged a deal with the governor of Alabama and Mississippi, where the governors would agree to state police and National Guard protection. In return, the federal government would not intervene with local police from arresting the Freedom Riders for violating segregation ordinances once they arrived at the bus depots. May 24th, the Freedom Riders boarded buses on their journey to Jackson, Mississippi. Surrounded by state police and National Guard protection, the buses arrived at Jackson without incident. But once at the bus terminal, the riders were immediately arrested when they tried to use the white-only facilities. This started a pattern of subsequent freedom rides, most of which ended in Jackson, Mississippi, where the riders were then arrested and jailed. Their strategy was to fill the jails. Once Jackson and Hinds County jails were overflowing, the state transferred the freedom riders to the infamous Mississippi State Penitentiary known as the Parchment Farm. There, they encountered abusive treatment, including being placed in a maximum security unit, which was also used to house death row, the issuance of only underwear, a shower only twice a week, no books, no exercise, no male privileges, and when freedom riders refused to stop singing, prison officials took away their mattresses, sheets, and toothbrushes. Still, more freedom riders arrived from across the country, and at one point there were more than 300 at Parchment Farm. During this time, U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy issued a statement asking for a cooling-off period in the face of growing violence and condemning the rides as unpatriotic because they were embarrassing the country during the height of the Cold War. CORE, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee rejected the idea of a cooling-off period, and the groups would form a Freedom Rides Coordinating Committee to keep the rides rolling through September of 1961. May 29, 1961, the Kennedy administration announced that it had directed the Interstate Commerce Commission to ban segregation in all facilities under its jurisdiction. But the rise continued. With the participation of students from northern states came even more press coverage. During these months, more than 60 freedom riders crisscrossed the South, most of them converging in Jackson, Mississippi, and almost every single rider was arrested and ended up at the Parchment Farm. September 1961, CORE and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee made tentative plans for a mass demonstration known as the Washington Project. The plan was to mobilize hundreds of nonviolent demonstrators at the city's capital to apply pressure on the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Kennedy administration. The idea was preempted when the Interstate Commerce Commission finally issued regulations prohibiting segregation at interstate transit terminals. The new policies went into effect November 1st, 1961, and after the ICC's rules took effect, passengers were permitted to sit wherever they pleased on interstate buses and trains. White or colored signs were removed from the terminals. Also, lunch counters began serving all customers, regardless of race. The Freedom Riders established a great credibility with young white and black Americans throughout the United States and inspired many to engage in the direct action of the civil rights movement. Perhaps most significantly, it helped inspire participation in subsequent civil rights campaigns, including voter registration drives throughout the South, freedom schools, and eventually the Black Power movement. Thank you. This has been The Freedom Rides. I'm your host, Country Boy, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on Buy Me Coffee on my Patreon page in the description below. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. Peace.